Hello! In another of my occasional series of maritime history talks, I'm going to take a look at position fixing at sea, the finding of the longitude, John Harrison's famous clocks and watches, and his perceived nemesis, the Board of Longitude, and the Astronomer Royal of his day, the Reverend Nevil Maskelyne. In 1995, Darva Sobel's book Longitude was published, with a two-part TV film released in 2000. It told two stories, one about the life of Rupert Gould, played by Jeremy Irons, who rescued John Harrison's marine timekeepers, languishing in disarray in the basement of the Royal Observatory, Greenwich. The other story was of Harrison himself, played by Michael Gambon, the development of his marine timekeeper and his son's battles with the Board of Longitude, as it was known. Both book and film are excellent and give a good indication of Harrison's genius, but Sobel has coloured the present view of the matter, and it's now worth another look. Sobel's story effectively starts with this man, Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel, something of a fashion victim in that wig. Shovel had gone to sea at the age of 14, risen through the ranks, fighting bravely in many sea battles. He was a popular British hero and a favourite of Queen Anne by the time he was leading a fleet back to England from the Mediterranean in October 1707. The weather worsening and the fleet being many miles northwest of their believed position, Shovel's flagship, Association, led several others onto the rocks of the Isles of Scilly. Association went down in a matter of minutes, and all her 800 men were lost. In total, over 2,000 sailors' lives were lost that night. The legend is that Shovel was washed ashore alive, but a local woman then hit him on the head to steal his rings, and, as this came from a deathbed confession by the woman, we must accept it as true. Examination of the 44 surviving logbooks from the fleet showed errors in the ship's longitude of between 1 and 3 degrees, which, at the latitude of the Scillies, equates to between 60 and 180 nautical miles, the distance from London to Leeds. They could have been anywhere within that ellipse. Here was yet another proof, after many hundreds of ship losses, that a cheap and easy way to calculate longitude was the most pressing need of the maritime world, and with the alacrity for which it's famed, 7 years later, the British government set up the Commissioners for the Discovery of the Longitude at Sea, also known as the Board of Longitude, to administer a scheme of prizes intended to encourage a solution of the problem. £10,000 for a method that could determine longitude within 1 minute, or 60 nautical miles, £15,000 for a method that could determine longitude within 40 minutes, or £20,000 for a method that could determine longitude within 30 minutes or 30 miles. Now, that £20,000 is roughly the equivalent of £3 million today. Now, it was rather poignant that Shovel should have perished when he himself had a great interest in navigational improvements. He had had meetings with Isaac Newton just a few years before his death to look at a French proposal for finding longitude. So making a landfall was always the most dangerous time for ships. Whether it was a rocky, cliffed-back shore or a low-lying atoll or reef, if it wasn't charted correctly, or if you didn't know your own position, hitting land was an unpleasant fact for many seamen of old. In ancient times, when early humans first took to the sea and ventured out of sight of land, they needed reference points, and those would be the sun, the moon, and stars. In the northern hemisphere, it was noted many hundreds of years BC that the pole star was a fixed position upon which to rely, and the ancients quickly created the celestial shapes that we now call constellations out of various stars to aid identification of the heavenly map. And we know that by 600 BC, one Thales of Miletus was running courses for Ionian sailors on how to steer a course using Ursa Minor. Now, if we look at man-made aids to navigation, then we must mention the compass. The Chinese invented the magnetic compass about 200 BC, and this was taken to sea, but, we think, not until the 1st or 2nd century AD. But it was also around 200 BC that the Greek philosopher Eratosthenes put forward the concept of a grid of lines, that we now refer to as latitude and longitude, to better fix positions on a map or chart. Eratosthenes also calculated the circumference of the world with very great accuracy. He was just 99 miles out, a remarkable achievement for his day. He may also have been involved in creating the Astrolabe, which was a device for locating and predicting the positions of the sun, moon, planets and stars, and thus determining local time by checking the angle between the sun and the horizon. When the sun is at its highest, it is noon, wherever you are, of course, and allowing you to sail along a latitude by keeping that noon angle the same day on day. Besides the astrolabe, other tools were created. The simple cross staff for measuring angles of the sun, which evolved into the backstaff because navigators were being blinded looking directly at the sun, and that eventually evolved into that very precision machine, the sextant. So latitude was relatively easy to calculate, but if you can't yet calculate longitude, how do you know exactly where you are on the open ocean? Here you are, happily sailing along a line of latitude. If you can't calculate your longitude, how do you know how far you've travelled west, or conversely east? And how do you know how near you are to the landmass that you know is somewhere in front of you? You have to use dead reckoning. Well, a log line gives you the speed of your vessel. That's a long length of rope with knots tied in it at regular and specific points. You throw the weighted end overboard and let the line pay out for a specific period, using something similar to an egg timer, for instance, and you then stop the line with your fingers as the timer runs out, drag the line back and count the number of knots that have run through your fingers. And that is, of course, the origin of the unit speed of a ship, the knot, 1 nautical mile per hour, which is equivalent to 1.15 land miles per hour. Now, the log may be used every couple of hours, and over a period of, say, 12 hours, let's say the ship's speed appears to have averaged out at 3 knots. We therefore calculate that we've sailed a total of 36 nautical miles. Now, that is dead reckoning. But it does rely on the wind having blown steadily throughout the period and not changing direction. And, of course, what if there are sea currents that are pushing you on, or indeed holding you back? Unless you can find your exact longitude, you cannot accurately plot your position. You may be many miles out using dead reckoning. So the requirement was obvious. Every 24 hours, the world turns 360 degrees, 15 degrees per hour. So if you sail westwards, you lose 1 hour for every 15 degrees. When noon on the ship is 1 hour earlier than your home port, you've sailed 15 degrees, and this can be accurately plotted on your chart. Now, this was certainly known back in the 15th century or before, but clocks were not accurate to even 10 minutes a day until Christian Huygens developed the Pendulum Clock in 1657. Accuracy was now improved to within a few seconds per day on land, and Huygens' technician, one Claude Milon, wrote to him saying that if you could have a spring-driven pendulum, one could wish for nothing more for the longitude. In other words, if you could allow for the movement of a ship not affecting a pendulum, then you could work out the time at sea. But such a timepiece that could be used at sea was a goal which would prove to be far off. Now the best effort came in 1717, when Henry Sully, an Englishman living in France, developed a marine timekeeper that performed quite well, but only in calm weather, which rather defeated the object. Now, with the names I've bandied about so far, you probably realise that the quest for solving of the longitude was an international problem. The first financial incentive was put forward by Philip of Spain in 1567, and in the Netherlands a set of prizes was offered in the year 1600. So the British prize of 1714 came rather late on the scene. Now, that's not to say we weren't involved before that date. The Gresham College group, which included Wren and Boyle and Hooke, who incidentally looks remarkably like Mick Hucknall in this picture, they became the Royal Society under Charles II's charter in 1660, and they put much effort into the matter, and in fact one of the prime aims of the society was the finding of the longitude. The Royal Observatory in Greenwich was founded by King Charles under the Society's auspices in 1675, specifically to carry out observations to find out the so much desired longitude of places for the perfecting of the art of navigation. Now, many reasoned ideas were put forward to the Board of Longitude from its inception. The enormous sum of money offered, £20,000, equivalent to at least $3 million today, concentrated people's attention admirably, but it also brought out the crackpots, and the longitude lunatics became a popular subject for caricature. In fact, in the last plate of Hogarth's The Rake's Progress, when the rake has been committed to Bedlam, there are two references to the longitude and madness. If I just expand this point, you can see, first of all, there's a man with a rolled up newspaper or something, using it as a telescope, and behind him there's a man drawing on the wall, drawing the globe. He's written longitude, he's shown the moon, and he is working on the longitude problem. But now to the two main protagonists of Davor Sobel's Longitude, Harrison and Maskelyne. Because of the difficulties of producing a mechanical watch accurate enough to be used aboard ship, and the great prospects for astronomical methods of measuring longitude, bearing in mind great improvements had taken place in telescope optics by Dolland and others, it's not surprising that the board was somewhat biased towards the Lunar Method, as it was called. But Sobel and others have, I think, very much overstated the opposition of the board to Harrison. The board part-financed a German, Tobias Meyer, who'd furthered work done by Galileo more than 100 years before regarding the phases and movements of the moon and certain stars. Meyer formulated tables that showed how the lunar method could be used for longitude, and his tables could be calculated for years ahead. Here's an example. Here's our ship at sea, and for this example we're going to use the star Regulus. We take a sighting of the moon to calculate its altitude above the horizon, using a sextant of course. We take a sighting of Regulus and compute its altitude. We measure the angle between the two, which gives us the lunar distance. We then consult the published table for that year, month, day and hour, and using trigonometry, this will give us our longitude. In the Longitude film, Sam West played the part of Nevil Maskelyne, but let's have a look at the real Maskelyne. He was a Cambridge mathematician and was appointed to test these tables out on a voyage. Although calculations from the tables could take 3 to 4 hours to complete, Maskelyne proved that they did work. Longitude at sea could be pinpointed. Now, what Maskelyne, and therefore the Board of Longitude, are after comes down to two things: accuracy and affordability. Maskelyne became the Astronomer Royal, and thus had an automatic seat on the Board of Longitude, and thus would, to some degree, sit in judgment on Harrison's marine timekeepers. And this has led Sobel and others to plot the two as rivals, and to a degree enemies. Maskelyne seeking to damn the use of timekeepers. But this is wrong. Maskelyne had a great interest in precision clocks and instruments. He commissioned the manufacture of several, and this is his own personal clock. And his correspondence indicates that he believed that they would be useful at sea. But he and the Board of Longitude had three major problems in this case. The first was with the secrecy that Harrison maintained over his creations. He appears to have been concerned about industrial espionage, but at this time there was a great deal of cross-fertilization of ideas between clockmakers, and Harrison himself benefited from Henry Sully's work, which was published in 1726, just as Harrison started on his sea clocks, and one must think that may well have been the thing that prompted him to start on manufacturing the sea clocks. Secondly, the instruments had to be shown that they could be replicated and produced cheaply enough to be affordable. Thirdly, it had to be shown that they stayed accurate year on year. One voyage of exploration could take 3 years or more, and therefore a single test to Jamaica and back, as the original Act required, was only the first stage of testing. The revised Longitude Act of 1765 that Harrison and his son William saw as a direct attempt to stop him claiming the prize was just a recognition that the original Act had been very badly drawn. It also instructed the Board of Longitude to produce an annual nautical almanac of astronomical tables for use at sea. Now, as Astronomer Royal from 1765, Nevil Maskelyne oversaw the collection and processing of the handwritten data to printed page and published these tables from the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Maskelyne and his assistants undertook the observations at Greenwich. He then directed the considerable mathematical work required to turn the observational data into usable tables through a network of human computers and comparers across the country. He wrote copious letters to these computers so they would understand the minutest detail of what they were about. The base information for each month was sent out separately to 2 computers in different parts of the country. They then sent their calculations to a comparer, whose job was obviously to compare the results. If there were any differences between the 2 sets of results, they were referred back to the computers for rechecking and reanalysis, and only then sent to Maskelyne at Greenwich, where they were then checked once again and compiled for printing. The results were published as the Nautical Almanac, and the tables requisite to be used with the Astronomical and Nautical Almanac. The price was kept low in order that the almanac could be easily afforded, and it was produced in similar form for well over 100 years. Because all the calculations were based on Greenwich, this led to Greenwich being made the world's prime meridian from 1884. Incidentally, much of the money used to pay the computers came out of Maskelyne's own pockets. Whilst he wasn't poor, he never became rich from his position. And another thing about Maskelyne, he was rather ahead of his time in another way. When one of his computers fell ill, the computer's wife took over the calculations unbeknown to Maskelyne. But this came to light when the computer himself actually died. Maskelyne, however, kept the widow on as computer. In addition, he trained his daughter Margaret as an astronomer, and she became a major help for him in the whole project. Now, I thought you might like to see his observing suit. This is what he wore for the cold nights in the observatory. It's heavily padded with integral feet like a baby grow, and is in this glorious yellow gold with red pinstripes. It only went on display for the first time a couple of years ago. Now, as Maskelyne was short and plump, this is how I imagine him. Let's now turn to Harrison, carpenter turned clockmaker, born near Wakefield in 1683, and he was indeed a genius, and the instruments that he created are truly wonderful. Let's have a brief look at them. H1, or Harrison 1, as it was labelled by Rupert Gould, was a huge machine dominated by spring-loaded pendulums that were supposed to compensate for movement at sea. It was very unwieldy and did have a major flaw. It was built and mounted to allow for the swaying of a ship to and fro, but I think Harrison missed the point that ships don't just move in 2 directions, but in 4 and not in a uniform manner. Now H2 was still a very large machine designed to overcome that problem, but Harrison realised it too was flawed, never put it in for official testing, and built H3, seen here with its case. He wasn't happy with that either, and it too was never tested at sea. But now we come to the great leap forward. H4, a complete departure in type and scale, now down to 5 inches diameter. Let's just look at the full Harrison portrait by Thomas King. Behind him in the gloom is H3, which I've enhanced so you can see just how large it is. But he is holding a pocket watch in his hand. Let's zoom in. This is approximately 2.5 inches in diameter, so obviously not H4. Or is it? Well, Harrison had this pocket watch made by one John Jeffreys, stipulating some improvements to a standard Jeffrey watch, including a novel friction rest escapement. The main part of H4 was made by Jeffreys. When Harrison got hold of Jeffreys' watch, he subjected it to testing and started to make various alterations and to add bits so that it would work at sea. One of Harrison's main inventions was the bimetallic strip, 2 metals joined together to each compensate for the others growing or contracting in heat and cold, and he added these because that would be useful at sea. But the reason that H4 is double the size of the pocket watch is because of all the additions put in by Harrison. Now, this created a problem. One Larkham Kendall was given the job of copying H4 by the Board of Longitude, once they'd managed to prize it out of Harrison's hands. It proved to be very expensive to copy because of all the additions. Kendall and others tried to improve and simplify the mechanism with modest results. But credit where it's due, Harrison produced the first marine timekeeper, the first mechanism to be fully useful at sea. But the caveat that has to be mentioned is that much of his movement proved to be almost a dead end. And the movement that went on to be the basis of most future sea timekeepers was that of a Frenchman, Pierre Leroy. Working from around the 1740s, so effectively a contemporary of John Harrison, Leroy's detached escapement, combined with 1 or 2 elements of Harrison's design, was responsible for creating the marine chronometer as we know it. We'll now return to confront the question of whether we are looking at a battle between Maskelyne and the Board of Longitude on one side and Harrison on the other, whether this was Big Brother against the small chap, whether it was the Lunar Method versus the Timekeeper. Now, I've already said that lunars did work, as did the Timekeeper, but both had advantages and disadvantages. The lunars, they took several hours to calculate. They relied on celestial sightings which needed clear weather. There were completely new calculations each day, and so if you'd made a mistake in your calculations one day, the next day you might see it corrected. In other words, errors did not accumulate. The Timekeeper required just a noon sighting, but once again this relied on clearish skies, and it was simply a matter of comparing local noon with the watch's Greenwich set time to give the longitude. But if the watch either gained or lost time more than you expected, the error that caused to the position calculation was compounded day after day. Also, what would happen if the watch stops? In these early days of the timekeepers, it seemed obvious that both systems should be used side by side, and that was Maskelyne's and the board's position. Now, over the last few years, a major project's been undertaken by Cambridge University and the National Maritime and Royal Observatory Museums. The papers of the Board of Longitude, long collecting dust, have been fully examined, and much of Maskelyne's personal papers, diaries and notebooks have also come to light. From this massive paperwork, Harrison's son William doesn't seem to come out with too much credit, being far too blunt and offending the MPs, the clergymen and scholars who form the Board of Longitude, taking offence at the least thing and having no understanding of negotiation. it does appear to me that it is his view, which Darva Sobel took, that has coloured the story of the trials between Lunars and Timekeeper. He was, however, himself elected to the Royal Society in 1765 and cited as a scientific instrument maker on the back of his father's work. He became a governor of the Foundling Hospital in London, helping to teach music to the children, and was finally elected Sheriff of Monmouthshire in 1791. But let's now look at the major payments made by the Board of Longitude throughout its life. Now, Tobias Meyer was paid £3,000 for his work on those lunar calculations. Charles Mason had done some improvements. He was paid £1,317. Jesse Ramsden was paid £615 for his improvements to telescopes. And then John Arnold and Thomas Earnshaw were both paid £3,000 each for their own work on their own marine timepieces. But then we come to John Harrison, who was paid an astonishing £15,315, nearly £2.5 million in today's money, throughout the time of his work on the chronometers. Larkham Kendall, who made the copy of Harrison's H4, was paid £500 to do so. Now, Harrison then received a special one-off payment from Parliament of £8,750. So Harrison actually received £24,000, or £3.5 million today, and he died 3 years after this last payment in 1776. But he actually was paid over their lifetime more than the Longitude Prize itself. One name is notable in its absence, that of Maskelyne. He never even tried to claim the Longitude Prize. He knew he was working on the back of Tobias Meyer and others. But to return to H4, its story continues in the form of Kendall's copy, K1, and it's that we now follow. At Nevil Maskylyne's suggestion, note Nevil Maskylyne's suggestion, Larkham Kendall's K1 and two other marine timekeepers by John Arnold accompanied Captain James Cook on his second Pacific voyage, 1772-75, along, of course, with copies of the Nautical Almanac. K1 performed magnificently, and Cook came to call it his trusty friend and never-failing guide. And the watch also travelled on Cook's third voyage in 1776. But here's a prime indication of why the Board of Longitude's reluctance to rely entirely on a mechanical watch was correct. The watch stopped 3 years into what was a 4-year voyage. Now, Lieutenant James King was in charge of the Timekeeper on that voyage. Although he was a commissioned lieutenant, he was also being paid by the Board of Longitude for that very job. He had been trained as an astronomer. In a letter to the Admiralty, he says, "The enclosed account will show how Mr. Kendall's Timekeeper has performed till we made this coast," which was Kamchatka. But luckily for future proceedings, it stopped on the 26th of April 1779, 3 days after making the land. He went on to say the greatest care had been taken of it, never having been trusted in the hands of anyone other than Captain Cook and himself, and that its winding up was never neglected. Now, amazingly, there was a seaman aboard the ship, Benjamin Lyon, who'd served an apprenticeship with the London watchmaker. He was allowed to open the watch. He first of all found a minute piece of dirt between two teeth of a cogwheel, cleaned it, and got the watch going again. But it then stopped again a while later, and Lyon this time found a spring had broken due to a flaw in its manufacture. Even more amazingly, Lyon manufactured a replacement. But although K1 now worked again, the fact that it had stopped for an unknown length of time meant it could no longer be relied upon because it no longer held the exact Greenwich time. Now, as I indicated, Harrison's design was too complex and expensive. It could not be replicated easily enough to be issued to all the ships in the Royal Navy and be made available to the Merchant Marine. Harrison created just one more watch after K4, unsurprisingly known as K5. It was this Timekeeper that was tested by George III, found to be accurate, and Parliament was then petitioned to give Harrison that final award of £8,750. Officially, he was never awarded the Longitude Prize. In fact, it was never awarded to anyone. But Harrison was very well paid for the work that he'd done. These two systems, the Lunars and Timekeepers, worked successfully side by side for many years. In due course, the watches became known as marine chronometers and were improved beyond measure, and the safety of shipping and the charting of coastlines was thus also improved beyond measure. Initially, these chronometers were so expensive as to be as much as a half the cost of a whole ship, but by the second half of the 19th century, the cost had dropped enough that their use overtook those of lunars. Now, today we all have watches that are as accurate or more accurate than these chronometers, and for a fraction of the price. And with time now being carried on mobile phones and other devices, even watches are becoming just fashion accessories for younger people. And man's ingenuity in creating our own celestial objects, geosynchronous satellites that broadcast positions to our GPS receivers in phones, cars and shipping, has again turned the focus. We still depend on heavenly objects for navigation, just like our prehistoric ancestors. But back to Harrison and Maskelyne. Was Harrison the lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his day, as the strapline to Sabel's book says? I think not. Genius, yes, just look at those machines he created, but not soul or solo. Isaac Newton said in 1675, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, and thus acknowledging those whose work he had built on." So it should be with Harrison. And Maskelyne, instead of being thought of as anti-Timekeeper and as someone who did Harrison down, should also be recognised for the great work he did on helping to ensure safety at sea by the finding of the longitude. And now I've got something very special to show you, because these are my own replicas of two of the watches that I'm talking about. This first one is the replica of John Jeffrey's watch that was built for Harrison, and from which Harrison derived his H4. And as you could see, this is the one that Harrison is holding in the official portrait of him, and it's a lovely little thing. And so that's that one. And here is a replica of Larkham Kendall's K1, which in turn was the copy of John Harrison's H4, and you could see the relative size of that. If I hold them together, you can really see the differences in size. So these are very special to me. These were crafted for me by a great friend, Bernard Higginbotham, and they are two of my prized possessions.